In the frozen wastes of Manchuria, during a fierce winter of 1910, a deadly plague was spreading. Entire towns were silenced, and in only 6 months, 60,000 people were killed. But thanks to the efforts of one doctor, it was the first time that personal protective equipment was worn in the face of such an outbreak, reducing the death toll significantly. In today's episode, we will cover the horrors of the Manchurian plague. It is perhaps helpful to start with a description of the plague that ravaged through Manchuria. It was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacteria, the same bacteria responsible for the Black Death that blighted 14th century Europe. The plague has 2 clinical types, bubonic and pneumonic. The cause of the infection will determine which type a person ends up with. The most common type of plague is bubonic plague, which is transmitted by the bite of an infected flea. This is the type that caused the Black Death and is characterized by the swollen buboes, fever, and during the Black Death, a mortality rate of anywhere from 30 to 75%. However, pneumonic plague is far more toxic and far more deadly. It affects the lung tissues within 24 hours of exposure and can be transmitted through the air from human to human via infected droplets when an infected person coughs. Symptoms of pneumonic plague will present in 1 to 4 days after exposure to the bacteria. The symptoms will start with a cold sensation, loss of appetite, and a headache. Within 24 hours, the patient will have a bloody cough due to the infection of the lungs. If not treated properly, the rapid onset of symptoms will kill the patient very quickly, pulmonary septicemia usually being the cause of death. The source of the bacteria is understood to be the Tarbagan marmot, a burrowing groundhog-like animal that was hunted for its fur. Demand for such cheap furs exploded, leading to many migrant hunters to move to Manchuria. Many were inexperienced, handled infected marmots incorrectly, and lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. All of this proved to be the perfect environment for the disease to spread. The plague began in the autumn of 1910, with the first case near the Russian-Chinese border. Soon, cases were identified in Harbin, a city with around 60,000 people. Following the end of the Russo-Japanese War, which concluded in 1905, both nations continued to maintain a presence in Manchuria. China, Russia, and Japan all competed for Manchurian resources, and the region's railway networks were interconnected. In Harbin, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, European, and American workers and traders were present. This meant that when the plague struck, many countries had a vested interest in dealing with the outbreak. By January 1911, more than 10,000 deaths had been recorded. Often the mortality rates were close to 100%, with as many as 150 people dying a day. In Harbin, 5,000 people died in a matter of weeks, many dying after only 48 hours of symptoms presenting. All manner of attempts to cure the disease were used, but to no avail. Patients were bled, prescribed mercury and herbal remedies, but nothing worked. As the plague struck in the winter, the negative 30 Celsius temperatures meant that digging graves was impossible. Bodies could not be burned quickly enough, leaving frozen bodies piled up like firewood. They were left to be fed upon by the wild dogs. There is a readily available image online that is not suitable for YouTube, showing a medical professional in full protective gear stood next to frozen remains of plague victims. They are quite literally piled up like logs. One dispatch written in the Lancet Medical Journal described the horrors as follows. Human activity in this place seems to have completely died out. The streets are empty and deserted, and all the houses are left desolate. Dogs alone roam the streets, howling and feeding on the corpses of their former masters. The stench is horrible. As the matter grew ever worse, the Chinese authorities ordered an investigation into the plague. The man who was tasked with leading the investigation was Dr. Wu Lien-te. He was born in Penang, British Malaysia in 1879 to parents who were Chinese immigrants. At 17 he won a scholarship to study at Cambridge University, winning many scholarships and awards during his studies, and would go on to specialise in tropical diseases. Despite his clear talent, he would struggle to find work in British Malaysia, and in 1907 he moved to China. There he was appointed vice director to the Imperial Army College near Beijing. When the disease first struck, Dr. Wu visited Harbin and saw firsthand the plague's deadly effects. Dr. Wu would write in his autobiography the following: "Everywhere I saw people suffering from high fever, coughing blood, and dying suddenly. As far as the eye could see, the roads were covered with corpses." He was able to conduct a post-mortem on a Japanese woman, which at the time was not allowed in China, but he was permitted to do so following a presidential mandate allowing him to investigate the plague properly. Dr. Wu noted damage to the woman's lungs and confirmed the plague was pneumonic and not bubonic, which was initially suspected. Realizing the disease was likely spread through the air, he requested that the Chinese authorities provide suitable masks for all healthcare professionals. Dr. Wu is often called the man behind the mask, seen as the inventor of using face coverings to prevent the spread of pneumonic plague. However, similar masks did exist in other countries and were made from gauze or whatever material they could find. What Dr. Wu did popularize, however, is a type of mask that was inspired by Victorian ventilators. This was a mask made by padding layers of cotton and gauze with strings so that the user could secure it to their head. The mask was designed to be cheap and easy to manufacture, and is the precursor to the N95 respirator. Dr. Wu ensured that everyone who needed a mask had access to cheap, readily available masks to help bring the plague under control. But not everyone believed Dr. Wu, and some would ignore his findings altogether. One of Dr. Wu's most vocal critics was a French doctor by the name of Gerald Mesquinet. Gerald had dealt with a number of disease outbreaks in Manchuria and was quick to join in the efforts to deal with the plague. But he disregarded Dr. Wu's findings and believed that the masks were unscientific and would offer no protection. Only a few days after seeing patients without a mask, Gerald passed away from the plague. But Gerald's death proved to be a turning point. The remaining doctors and officials now understood that Dr. Wu was not only right about his methods, but that his methods could save their lives. One other notable example to deal with the plague was quarantine. Those with suspected cases and those who had been in contact with infected people were quarantined on train carriages. If no symptoms developed after 5 days, the quarantined people were released with a wire bracelet identifying them as disease-free. If the disease struck at home, the entire household was isolated, and any contaminated items were destroyed. Squads of workers, clad head to toe in personal protective equipment, would tour the towns, looking out for any person showing signs of infection. Such people would be tested, quarantined, and looked after as best they could, but most would simply die. Travel was also suspended as to stem the plague from spreading to other regions. Hundreds of medical professionals were trained in how to best deal with the plague and to enforce the rules of quarantine. These strict and unprecedented steps proved to be effective, as by March of 1911 the plague outbreak was over. But in just 4 months, the Manchurian plague had claimed an estimated 60,000 lives. Most of the victims died within days of showing symptoms. The majority of those who died were Chinese labourers and hunters, but plenty of Russian and Japanese people perished too. The disease had the potential to become a global catastrophe, but thanks to the hard work of 11,000 unknown workers and the leadership of Dr. Wu, the worst was avoided. The spring after the plague was brought under control in China, Dr. Wu hosted the International Plague Conference, the very first large-scale medical summit of its kind. Respirators and masks were a focal point of conversation, and many Western scholars believed that they could effectively prevent plague. The international community were keen to learn about the steps taken, realizing that a unified global effort to combat such outbreaks would be vital. It should be noted that this meeting took place well before the establishment of the World Health Organization, which would be founded in 1948. Participants of this conference included the USA, Great Britain, Germany, France, Mexico, Netherlands, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Japan, and China, with over 30 leading experts attending. There, they discussed the consequences of asymptomatic patients, superspreaders, and promoted the use of Western medicine and public health in China. What was learned in the Manchurian plague would go on to shape the response to future deadly disease outbreaks in the decades to come. In the years that followed, Wu would continue his work in disease prevention. In subsequent disease outbreaks, he would improve the design of his mask. In 1915, Dr. Wu founded the Chinese Medical Association, the country's largest and oldest non-governmental medical association. During the Spanish flu, doctors would use the Wu mask, and respirators of today can trace their lineage to the masks worn during the Manchurian plague. During the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Dr. Wu was arrested by the Japanese on suspicion of being a spy. In 1937, he became the first Malaysian nominated for the Nobel Prize in Medicine. He was awarded this for his work during the Manchurian plague. He would return to Malaysia in 1937 to work as a general practitioner, but the Second World War would see him caught between the Japanese occupiers and the Malaysian resistance movement. At one point, he was captured and was ransomed by the resistance, and later he avoided imprisonment by the Japanese only because he had successfully treated an influential Japanese officer. Dr. Wu would continue to practice medicine until his death on the 20th of January 1960. He was 80 years old when he passed. The Manchurian plague is a truly disturbing example of a deadly disease. Its near 100% mortality rate could have resulted in a global pandemic with devastating consequences. But it's also a story of the importance of international unity in the face of a medical catastrophe. The plague brought together the competing rivals of Japan and Russia to work together, forcing them to combat a deadly disease rather than to continue their plans to dominate Manchuria. The legacy of Dr. Wu is one we should all remember, as his contributions prevented the Manchurian plague from becoming an even more infamous pandemic.